Welcome everyone to The Bottom Drawer, the latest online series by the Bagri Foundation. I'm Chelsea Pettit, I'm Head of Arts, and I'm excited to present the third interview in the series aimed at writers. We asked them to ponder a number of questions that tells us a bit about what inspired them to write, hinged around early efforts, unpublished writing, those that are often described as the bottom drawer because that's where they end up being left. Today, we're privileged to have the writer Sharlene Teo join us. If you have additional questions for her, leave them in the comments afterwards, and we'll endeavor to try and answer those. Just a brief bio for those. She was born in Singapore and lives in London. She completed an MA and PhD at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, where she received the UEA Booker Scholarship and the David T.K. Wong Creative Writing Fellowship. So many awards. Her debut novel, Ponti, won the inaugural Deborah Rogers Writers Award and was shortlisted for the Hearst Big Book Award, longlisted for the Jhalak Prize, and selected by Ali Smith, the fabulous Ali Smith, as one of the best debut works of fiction in 2018. So, as I mentioned, Sharlene, I'd love to touch upon Ponti just briefly. You've been already sort of promoting it for about, a year and a half, almost 2 years, I guess. So there's lots of fantastic existing interviews, so we don't need to sort of dwell on it. But as it was your debut, it would be great to talk a little bit about it, specifically around the influence of B-movie horror genres. There's so many, for me, the overarching feeling of the book was this kind of, absent mother, seances, ghosts, all kinds of really beautiful imagery that was created. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about the influence of film on that book.
Yeah, no, I love that question. I'm deeply engaged and inspired by the cinematic medium. So I think that it's also kind of a different sort of engagement where I can lose myself a lot more than books, because books I've always, ever since I was a teenager, I've always been reading them with one eye toward a mixture of like envy and admiration, and I'm always kind of keeping my antenna up for like what I could learn from a text, especially a text that is outside of the bounds of my normal taste or something that I haven't come across before. Whereas with film, I really like going to the cinema alone and just sitting there. And I'm like one of those people that's like, be quiet around me. Like I wouldn't say anything, but I just really love letting something wash over me.
Mm-hmm.
And really being deeply engaged with the ways in which movies are really transporting, and they're really, they leave an immediate impact. You can tell afterwards all at once like what you felt about it. Whereas I think with a book is so much more of a slow burn. So I've kind of always admired, in some ways, other art forms. Like if I was a violinist, or if you were a painter even, people can make an aesthetic judgment immediately. Whereas I think people's engagement with literature is a lot more personal and kind of complex. So that's what's rewarding about it on one hand. But on the other hand, what you get a lot of the time is a sort of like, there's endless bits of subjectivity because you dip in and out of the book. So you could be like, I didn't like the first third, so it's not for me. Whereas film, 2 hours, you get out of the way, and you can make up your mind almost immediately. So I think back to your question with Ponti, I was really, really interested in the idea of monsters, and particularly in giallo horror, and like there's that kind of deliberate aesthetic of like schlock and like, honestly, women getting kind of murdered in very gory, tacky ways. But I think there's a playfulness to those films, particularly from the 70s. I'm not a fan at all of splatter horror, like kind of what's the word? Like the Saw movies, that kind of development.
Oh, yeah.
I hate that. Torture porn. Sorry. I hate that. But it's where it looks almost deliberately fake that interests me, because that there's a kind of knowing wink toward the viewer, and it also raises questions about our expectations of a monster. Like oftentimes the scariest thing is off screen, right? So if you, or the scariest thing is what is familiar, like the uncanny, the unheimlich, like the horror film It Follows. That's like the monster could be anyone. Brilliant. Yeah.
But as long as it's female in this case, there's a feminism that's attached to the Pontiac.
Yeah. And that kind of the Pontiac being the Southeast Asian mythical trope of this very attractive woman who's she kind of wanders around at night and kind of preys on men, and basically, you know, they come to a very, very violent end. And I think that can be traced to old superstitions or old wives' tales, as they call it, which is quite a gendered term as well, of you know, the kind of fear of a young woman interfering with the family unit. And also it's interesting that the mythology also stems part of it from a kind of, you know, a tragic childbirth. So I think it really ties into our ideas of femininity and cultural expectations of how women should and shouldn't behave, how they look harmless versus the actual harm that they might supernaturally inflict on people. So these are all ideas that I had brewing in my mind for a long time.
Well, that kind of leads really smoothly, I guess, into the characters, because I imagine with the Pontiac myth, you know, when you talk about the woman who sort of lost a child, or there was a child, a stillborn child, potentially there's sort of different variations on that. But then Sue, her daughter, Amisa's daughter, also feeling that kind of disconnect. I suppose I wondered if there was any influence on that myth in the relationship, the mother-daughter relationship that you developed, or if the characters were just sort of very much developed as individual concepts, and then you interwove that kind of relationship.
Well, I started off trying to write the novel from the point of view of an actual Pontianak in first person. But I don't think that I really, the issue was that it was just a cool idea, and I really didn't know what to do with it. I mean, I had quite a lot of fun sort of exploring that in first person, but really the most interesting part of that kind of early seed was that juxtaposition between superstition and technology, technology which renders nothing mysterious versus the mysteries of superstition, the old versus the new, and obviously this idea of monstrous femininity. But I wrote this failed novella where she was flying everywhere, and she'd go into a supermarket and poke the meat, you know. She'd like hang out at graveyards, she'd like ambush terrible people like outside bars and like suck out their eyeballs. But it really wasn't going anywhere because there was no kind of, I feel like from my experience, I haven't written 10, but hopefully one day I will. From my increasing experience, I don't think that you need to be entirely clear when you're studying a novel where it ends. In fact, sometimes that's not very helpful. I think that what I feel is necessary, and that's why I think people take time between novels, because we're human beings and we need to live and we need to kind of absorb the world before you kind of accumulate enough conceptual and existential ideas of what you want to explore through the act of writing. So for me, just having that cool idea wasn't enough of an impulse. I had to kind of dig deeper and come up with more ideas around that before it became substantial enough to kind of turn into a story. Yeah. So sorry. So Sue, the younger, her only daughter, I thought with the idea of an actress acting as a monster, and the kind of fraught relationships that mothers and daughters have. Like, I'm thinking of actually the Bergman film Autumn Sonata. I love that. It's about a mother who's a concert pianist, and her daughter like tries to play the piano as well, but it's obviously not as good. And the mother is like criticizing her theme, her work. So there's this well-known thing of like mothers and daughters often have complicated relationships, fathers and sons. So I thought this girl who's not at all like her mother would be watching the kind of archival footage of her mother in the bloom of her youth, and the sort of tension and regret and not feeling good enough that would raise. So that's really where that came from. Yeah.
Well, that reminds me then of some of the early work that we briefly talked about. You mentioning the voice of the monster, trying to write something from the voice of the monster. Do you have an extract there that we talked about having an extract? Yeah, okay, perfect. Do you think you'd want to read that out? Some of the early kind of efforts?
Yeah, I'm just gonna look. I don't want, how long are you talking?
Oh, we can talk for like 30, 40 minutes, a bit longer.
I'm just looking at what part to read you. I don't want to read too long, you see. Yeah, this is a like an early bit, and this is when I was trying to write as the monster. So I'll read you two like short like paragraphs from it.
Okay. Great.
I'm nervous because obviously I've never read this out aloud before.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll see.
It was narrated by a very old Pontianak, like one of those monsters that we're talking about.
Yeah.
In 2003, by the time I re-emerged from the drowsy, corpulent roots of the banyan tree, everyone was much better at hiding their loneliness. I had difficulty seeing straight, thinking back the world after a 35-year sleep. All 32 teeth in my mouth tasted of sour, plaque-ridden 35. My sluggish tongue confirmed this. My arms and legs quivered and ached. I suppose it was the drugs they had started injecting in the soil that made me feel sprightly, chatty, yet irrevocably resigned. I knew it was going to be a hard slug, this being awake. Difficult, bleeding into impossible. I knew that things were not the same as I'd left them in July 1968, that this was no longer that fraught but familiar world that I had abandoned for sleep, purring complacently as I folded my fingers over my face, and my long hair cleaved, limp and loving into my forehead. Somebody loves alliteration. And then the second short bit, is that okay? Okay. So then she talks about when she went into the tree.
Okay.
When I finally slept, my sleep was dreamless, opaque, anesthetized. I slept through rocket launches and bell bottoms. I slept through earthquakes and fancy restaurants. I slept through cat lives and economic crises. I slept through charming and less charming popular hits. I slept through books closing and cars careening off highways. I slept through riots and newly minted skin allergies. I slept through the extinction of several 100,000 indigenous dialects and species of plants and animals. I slept through yo-yos and dictatorships. I slept through miracles and porn videos. I slept through the invocation of the internet and the brief, fruitless bloom of the mini disc. There you go.
That's great. I mean, what I really like about it is, I suppose, what gives you the ability, because it's this kind of all-seeing creature, you're able to sort of move through decades and times as seen through one lens, which is kind of kind of an amazing ability to create a character where you can do that. But I suppose what you did then in the end with Ponti is you have sort of three different generations, I guess, seeing something similar through their eyes instead.
Yeah.
And what made you change your mind about writing? You said it didn't kind of go anywhere.
Basically I got a fellowship to work on that book, and it was 9 months long, which is the gestation of a baby, and I basically felt like Jack Nicholson in The Shining, because I was in this Soviet style flat on campus, and I would look out through the large windows and I would see these undergraduates like playing beer pong or whatever, and it was all very depressing for me, because I'd been so excited to like return from to move from an office job into my MA to be a student again. But that year of the fellowship, all my MA friends had like left, obviously, so I just felt like I was this weird ghost on the campus. Like, you know, I was just slightly that much older than these undergraduates, and I felt very kind of lost, like creatively. I was like, I don't know if this novel will go anywhere. So I tried writing it. I wrote bits of it. I probably wrote quite a lot of words of it over the year, but it just wasn't forming.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had one friend on campus, because she was also a fellow. She was wonderful, and she was leaving for America, and she gave me these crackers. It was just like her leftover, like, you know, when you're clearing out your cupboards. Yeah. She's not going to take her food with her, so she gave me these are organic crackers, and they were called Amisa.
Oh wow!
So I was like, yeah. So Amisa's named after a gluten-free cracker.
Wow. Okay, that's so funny that like the inspiration for a character came from some crackers that somebody was just cleaning out of their cupboard.
Yeah.
Love it. Simple everyday things that you just never know are going to send you in a certain tangent or on a certain path.
Yeah.
That's great. So let's talk a little bit about the early efforts and what took you to do your MA in the end, because I imagine as many people who love writing have journals when they're kids, or create and write when they're young. How did that sort of your interest in writing develop?
Yeah, I've basically always written. I've always kept notebooks and storybooks. I used to like illustrate stories, write stories. I've always a graphomaniac. I've always kept diaries. So in the past, when I've had friends come and stay or house sit for me, I've said there's only one rule: don't read my diaries.
Oh my God, no, never.
A gross violation. Mm-hmm. So I've always had journals and diaries. Because this is how I
have a little lock on your. Did you have a little lock on your diaries? I used to have little locks on mine.
No, I didn't. My mother was a huge snoop. I think she like read quite a lot of them. Yeah. So yeah, I've always written, and I've always wanted to be a writer. So like it's really nice. Like I think like adulthood, like kind of knocks that out of you. Like because being a writer is such a solitary act, and it's there are no guarantees of success. Like, you know, it's really one book at a time. So it's quite a hard ambition to sustain. Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose you have to have quite a lot of self-motivation. I mean, so many people, I mean, a lot of authors don't even get, you know, published until they're sort of in their late 30s, 40s, or they've changed careers.
Yeah.
What were you working on? You said you were in an office job before.
Yeah, I was working in business publishing, so it wasn't really, you know, kind of literary publishing at all. And I also interned at a big publisher to kind of get a sense of what it was like. Yeah.
That's good.
And I remember that they had one of their like, they were like, these are our summer titles or whatever. And there were all these sandwiches. And I remember I went in and I just like ate all these sandwiches. I ate like 8 of them or something. And they were showing like the slides, the PowerPoint of the titles coming out. And they were like, Harry Styles biography, Harry Styles second biography. Blah, blah, blah. And then like a bunch of fiction. And I was like, you know what? I want to be up there one day. I want to be on the PowerPoint, you know, after the Harry Styles biographies.
After his biographies come out every 5 years for his life.
Yeah.
I mean, you must have been sort of seeing what's coming out and just thinking there's a voice lacking here. There's stories not being told.
Well, I mean, like I mean, I think there's been a lot of, quite encouragingly, there's been a lot of discussion in the media about the fact that there's not a lot of diversity in publishing, just even across fiction and nonfiction. But I think that this is something that hopefully is changing and is evolving, and I'm seeing it reflected really even in the past 5 years, where I feel there's a lot more of an appetite for works in translation. Even people that normally only read fiction kind of crossing over and reading a lot of nonfiction, creative nonfiction. So I really think in terms of readership, people are a lot more open-minded.
Yeah. And so in terms of the early works that you did, besides sort of journals and diaries, you mentioned little illustrated books. What were the stories like? Were they short stories? Were they poems?
I started off as a poet. So I used to write poetry, and yeah, there were always poems in the beginning, and then I moved on into short fiction. So I worked predominantly in short fiction and poetry when I was a teenager. Yeah.
Nice. And how has your style changed since? Because you briefly mentioned, I think, in other interviews about the long form giving you a bit more of what you needed.
Yeah, there's just a kind of expansiveness. Basically, like I'm sometimes quite a tentative person in that I feel I can focus on one thing the best. I love short fiction. I think it's a misunderstanding. A question that always kind of irked me, frankly, in interviews around Ponti was, oh, you know, sometimes it really reads like a movie. Why don't you make it a screenplay? As if just because you're working with alphabets, it's the same thing. It's like telling like if you're a pastry chef and I'm like, Chelsea, why don't you whip up a steak? You're like,
Well, specialty, thanks. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's I think I really believe in respecting forms. Like I still read a lot of poetry, but I dip in and out of it, and I just don't think that I have the sort of creative energy to like do everything. I know some people can and they're real polyglots, but I think I'm just interested in really getting to know characters, and the space in which you get the most time with your characters is really in a novel. So
true. Yeah. This is just coming to my brain now. In terms of the novel then, with working in a long form like that, how many different drafts did you go through for Ponti?
Well, I'm basically like the thing I'm identifying from that and this is that I'm very, from having done two books now, is that I'm very, very slow in the beginning, but when I kind of edit as I go. So like when I'm done, it's not a draft per se in that I did the whole thing and then rewrote it. It's more like I did it very slowly and then I rearranged it rather than I did anything too major. So it's hard for me to say, but I do take quite a long time. But I'm not, I think actually it might be more efficient to like just like kind of do a mind dump and then do it over and over again. But I don't think that I'm at that stage yet.
No, because I think I read that it took you like 4 years to write.
Yeah. Right? Yeah, that's including the first failed one, if you know what I mean.
So I suppose you're right, if you're constantly editing as you go rather than one whole brain dump, which is, you know, hundreds of pages that you just send to an editor who then has to make sense of it. I suppose for yourself, you're kind of editing as you go, which is a nice process, I guess.
Definitely not perfect, like by any means, but Yeah, but by the end of it, I'm so familiar with the text because I've looked at it so many times that I really remember it. So that's not very good sometimes for editing. Like, so like, yeah.
Yeah, I guess getting fresh eyes on it is really important if you've been sort of staring at the same thing over and over.
Yeah.
Even just me writing a small blog piece, it all melts into one. And to me, it's perfect. And then I send it off and someone's like, I don't quite know what you mean here. Like, oh, it made so much sense in my own head.
Right.
Great. Well, I do wonder then, as you were developing Ponti and you received the scholarships to your MFA, did you find that formal education was quite helpful for you?
Yeah, it was. I think it was because I think I would have just sat on my hands and procrastinated for like another couple more years. Like, I kind of felt like I was always not confident enough in my own, or I felt like if there was a form of knowledge seeking that I could take to like be better at what I want to be good at, then I would do it. It was always my plan to like to do it. But that being said, I don't think obviously that one needs an MFA or an MA to get published. It's just people's personal decisions of like how they what would be kind of most conducive for them and what would cause their kind of work or their creative voice to flourish. But I think there are a lot more other options, and I also think that there's quite an interesting sort of pushback against the idea of creative writing MAs and MFAs, and I think that returns to that sort of impulse or that distrust of the written word, because everybody can write.
Yeah.
So if everybody can write and spell and read, then there's less of a kind of trust or respect in a way for the kind of raw matter of the medium. And it becomes a different kind of issue or a different almost political question of like, who has accessibility to these MAs? Like, is it homogenizing creative thought? Is it, and I would say, I don't think there's any kind of easy answer for that. If anything, I think that those creative writing truisms, some of them make sense, and I think the pushback really, I don't believe in being didactic and saying like, this is right and this is wrong, but there are particular elements that we are like, that come up in say a creative writing classroom that do make sense. Like for example, something I always tell my students, so I teach an MA at St. Mary's, I always tell them, literary realism is not literal realism. So literal realism is like, oh, hi, how are you, Chelsea? Did you go to the shop? Yeah, I kind of did. And like basically giving me like 5 pages of boring dialogue that I will never get my life back from reading. Whereas like, literary realism is different layers of subtext, and there are different layers of metaphorical or mysterious significance that I'm really interested in exploring in fiction that is very, very unique to the form. So like it's different to cinema and music in that in fiction, what you're doing is you're giving people these literary and visual and emotional clues, and what they're doing is they're putting two and two together in their head, and they're imagining, I don't know, Madame Bovary looks like that to one person and a different way to another, and that kind of individual act of meaning and visualization is really what makes a book so interesting. So therefore, I love putting kind of mysterious, inexplicable shit in my books, because, and I can understand why people might hate that. They might be like, the plot is nonsense, or it doesn't make any sense, or why did you not explain that? But I really like, obviously there's a line of like not explaining because, and that's quite lazy, but I really like kind of putting multiple layers of meaning into things.
Yeah.
It
kind of reminds me of like people who, it's like Murakami's writing, which is sort of love or hate, right? So people either love that kind of magical realism, or they really can't get into it. They can't picture that. They can't take part in that because it's not so literal. So I guess it's just enjoying books on different levels. And I think that's what I really liked about Ponti, is that I could enjoy it for the characters, but I could also enjoy it for the horror genre, but I can also enjoy it for, mythology or the feeling of Singapore, where I have visited many times. And it's, the kind of energy of the city, or the tropics, the humidity, all those different, and people who maybe come from that background or a similar schooling background, people who've been teenagers. So there's all these, everyone's been a teenager. So there's all these different layers of being able to enjoy a book. And you're right, it's very personal and very individual. Whereas a film, it is very much presented at you. I don't know, it's like you read, as a kid, somebody reads a Harry Potter book or something, and then you see the film, and it might be totally what you imagined, or it might be completely different. And that's where a book can really come alive for people.
Yeah, massively.
The film can't. But before moving on to Ponti and talking about your inspiration, I just wanted to flag up how beautiful all the covers are.
Oh, thank you.
I wondered if you could, I don't know, talk a bit about how those came about. I guess, yeah, if it's you or your publisher or somebody has an eye for
the
art.
publisher, it's I think Picador predominantly. Yeah, no, I really love all my covers, and it's really a privilege and like a pleasure to see the different covers.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Such a beautiful design. That's the UK one there, and then we've got.
I love it. Quite funnily enough, in the initial image they showed me, she had long hair, and then they cut her hair into like a lob.
Oh, okay. And then there's this one, which is also very beautiful. Is that the French one?
Oh, this is a UK hardback, and also the French one is the same cover, and the I think the Dutch one is the same as well. Dutch and French.
I think this is the US one. Is it the bright red one?
US, yeah.
With long hair.
I love it.
I don't know about that one. I sort of feel like giving you a picture of who you're supposed to think Amisa maybe looks like is slightly, for me,
quite ethnically ambiguous. She looks quite like, you know, but I didn't mind it. And on the actual cover, it's a bit gold, that bit, which I really liked. I liked, and it reminded me of, have you seen, the poster for the film Blow Up?
No.
It's like, it looks like that. So it's red with the same kind of font. So I love that film. So I was like, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so back to the early years and inspiration. There's a question that we've been asking everyone as part of the series, which is, what is the book you wish you'd written?
I think I showed it to you just now, but I couldn't possibly have written it. This one,
Carson McCullens, yeah.
The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, which is probably my favorite book. She's 24. She's probably 22 when she wrote it. Jesus, she's like one of those people that was probably a really wise baby.
Yeah. Buddha baby, I call them, with this.
Yeah, that was totally her. But I just feel that I couldn't ever have written it. It's just takes place in the setting that I wouldn't understand, and the characters I wouldn't understand, the time I wouldn't understand, but it's just so humane and so textured and so empathetic and like shocking and sweet and cruel. I don't know, it's just a wonderful book. I think it's great.
Oh, fab. Are you drawn to those? Are you drawn to the books? I think you might have said this earlier, books that are set in a place that you couldn't otherwise understand or hear or have lived?
Not really. It's like, setting is not really my thing, like my main thing. I don't really read for different settings necessarily. I think I read just whatever, like a magpie, whatever catches my eye.
Okay, yeah, God, I'm quite similar, which, yeah. Does it mean that your reading list is like humongously long and you'll never get through it? Kind of, I mean, that's...
Yeah, it's mad, and I just like got a book delivery the other week, and I was like, why do I get more of them? That's why I really like skinny books though, because then you get through them quicker.
Yeah, not like, so daunting.
Yeah, they're not so daunting. So yeah, read everything.
Good. I saw your reading list on Refinery 29, I think maybe from last year or something. Yeah. Oh, and it's just, last time I spoke on the Bottom Drawer series to Zahra Hankir, this amazing Lebanese journalist and author, and she also gave me this huge list. We posted afterwards this huge list of books to read. So hopefully we'll do the same. We'll have some of your recommendations posted afterwards, because yeah, and then just the reading list just gets longer and longer, and I'm trying to sort of shove it in every time I get a chance to like sit down and read. I'm like, okay, I'm trying to ignore my husband while he, I don't know, watches cricket. I'm like, go watch cricket. I'll read this book, thanks. Got to fit it in when you can. The other one is, what is the book that made you want to write?
Oh, that's lovely. What's the book that made me want to write?
Well, I suppose you wanted to write since you were young.
When I was a teenager, I picked up this book it's called Crossing Border by a Singaporean short story writer called Tan Mei Ching. And I remember reading that, and like, firstly, like growing up in Singapore, there was one huge bookshop some of the bookshops in my childhood like got closed, so they got converted to other things. But there was one bookshop in the middle of town. It's like a Japanese chain bookshop. But you know, I'd go and, or there was also Borders, like these big bookshops, and you know, as a teenager or a child even, I just kind of go and sit there and read things. I remember reading The Virgin Suicides cover to cover and then buying it. But I mean, I read the whole thing in the shop because it was like I don't know, for like $16 or whatever. It's like a lot to a child, like pocket money. I mean, I was practically a child when I read that book. But I would read the whole thing. I read the whole thing there and then I bought it. Yeah, so there's that very, very sort of sentimental memories of that. So this was the first book that I read. In these stories, I was set, like I completely understood the context. I was so used to, you know, that kind of Anglo-American orientation of English literature, and it always being, you know, set in America, these stories, or you know, just not Singapore, not in an environment that I could understand really. So I think that really was eye-opening for me, because I felt that her stories were so sensitive and so melancholy and so interesting, and you know, there was an emotional texture that didn't feel forced.
Yeah. Oh, how lovely. I imagine when you were studying, was there not a huge kind of curriculum of Singaporean authors or even East Asian, Southeast Asian?
No, not. I mean, you know, I'm a millennial. I think it's changed a lot more in recent years, so I can't really comment on how that's changed, like the decolonization of the syllabus. Definitely when I was a teenager and growing up, you know, it was all like old white dudes. Yeah.
Growing up too, yeah, absolutely the same. Hopefully it has changed enough. I mean, even when I was young, I was still drawn to female authors, and I think I read that you were as well, not kind of consciously, but you know, I think in terms of to relate to something, I was always just trying to pick up books by women authors. And I think the only person who I ever thought really captured women well, who was a male author, I think was Khaled Hosseini's A Thousand Splendid Suns, which completely blew my mind how well he could write from the perspective of these women. But generally, I almost always picked up, books by women. And there's a book shop in London, do you know about it, that's focused completely on women? Second Shelf, yeah. And they just get absolutely hammered on Twitter by people because they're focusing on women authors. And it's just like, oh, they can't even just have one bookstore dedicated to female authors. Anyway. The last couple of questions are, who are the writers that inspired you, and why should we read their work? So, you know, not necessarily earlier in your career, but just throughout your life, really. Who's inspired you in terms of writing?
I really love Helen Oyeyemi. I think she's fantastic, and she's someone that I feel is like endlessly original and like doing her own thing. She writes very much in the vein of fabulous fiction, which I grew up loving. I loved Angela Carter when I was growing up, and the kind of richness of that world. I think it was always what female writers: Angela Carter, Jeanette Winterson, Margaret Atwood. I think when I was a teenager, I devoured these. I loved them so much. Deborah Levy. I remember reading Swimming Home, because it was like a very, very thin book, and there was something so kind of elegant and strange and beautiful about it. Who else? I really loved. There was a Taiwanese author. She only wrote 2 books called Chu Mountain. She's like a queer Taiwanese writer, and again, she's really doing her own thing, like really, really original, quite experimental. I love her. Let me see who else. There's so many. Bae Soo-ah, the Korean writer Bae Soo-ah. I love her. She's got this novella called Nowhere to Be Found, and the most dramatic device in there is the transport of a roast chicken. The woman is bringing a roast chicken across town to a terrible boyfriend. That is literally the story, but it's so great. So there's that. And then who else? So many. Is it almost like I have too many?
No, that's fine. We can always add more in comments if there's others. I mean, it's an endless list, I know, to try and put together. So I guess the last thing really is, you have just managed to finish your first draft, your deadline for your next book, and I wondered if you could speak about it generally without giving too much away.
Of course, yeah. So the working title is Take Care, and it's. I think I was interested really in the ways in which people sort of deal with not being able to communicate with each other, not being able to take care of themselves or to take care of each other. So like how they take care of that, you know, whether that's escaping through different addictions or escaping through being very emotionally withholding or really trying to find their identities through romantic entanglements. It's really also like meant as a kind of ironic phrase in the sense that it's often used in plotting. So I think I was interested in all those different aspects. Yeah, and it's also a very different book to Ponti. Yeah.
And how long have you been writing this one?
It's a similar trajectory to Ponti in that I straight after Ponti I started working on my next one, and I was like, oh, you know, I'm gonna be so fast, whatever. But I just basically floundered around, and I wrote of kind of failed scraps of novels, much like with the first one. And then all the way until November last year, I was like, actually, this isn't working. So I started on this in November, and I finished now. So that's been about 8 or 9, about 9 months.
9 months.
I think that it's because it is a product of all those ideas that we're gestating, and they weren't quite formed yet. So it took me like writing the failed kind of scraps to kind of clarify what I wanted to get out of it.
Yeah. Nice. Okay. So it sounds like a similar kind of, you put your head down and you had this kind of 9-month period of just trying to really focus on it. Also because you would have been touring and talking about Ponti so much with, you know, this award-winning book. It must be, I mean, it's like when I'm trying to read 2 or 3 books at a time, you've got all these different ideas and things you're trying to remember to talk about in terms of inspiration. It must be a little bit messy. I don't know, to hands down and write.
But yeah, now I have to see if this draft is workable. Kind of nerve-wracking, but I'm trying not to like identify too much with the work. Like, you know, it's hard.
Yeah, no, of course. And of course the sophomore, so they call it the sophomore
difficult second album.
Yeah, the second book, the sophomore album, exactly.
Yeah.
There will be expectations, but you know, as long as you stick to what you love and you feel good about it, that's what we're looking forward to hearing about and seeing. So do keep us posted on how that develops, when we can expect to see something. And I hope it's just as well received and as beautiful in the covers as Ponti has been. So yeah, thank you so much. I don't know if there's anything else you want to talk about in this day and age in which we're living for the Bottom Drawer series, early efforts, any advice, anything to end on?
Yeah, my advice would be starting small, and it's a marathon, not a race. So like I feel that with a long form project, it's not so much like ignore all the stuff that people put on Twitter or whatever. Like, you know, I wrote 3,000 words every day. That's really demoralizing. I think to me it's more about staying in the kind of conceptual space of what you're trying to tell and really thinking about that all the time. So I think like having the phone notes or keeping your journal or notebook by your bed, I think we learn a lot from the kind of subconscious and from the wonderful kind of soup of our dreams. Like that's where the most interesting things come about. And I feel like not cleaving it all to like expectations of what is and isn't a serious novel, what is and isn't going to be bought or received well. I don't really think one should do that. And I think that takes some of the pressure off, because then it becomes the original impulse, which is why we find comfort in stories and what stories are to us. And I think as long as it means something to you, that will translate.
Yeah, there'll be somebody out there that it will speak to. That's the key as well. Hopefully, always somebody. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, I was gonna say, if it's not personal. I think that's the other thing.
True. Yeah. Thanks again for joining. I'll just say to everyone who has watched to leave any questions in the comments, and I'm sure that, you know, Sharlene, you're quite active on Instagram and online, so hopefully we can get some more details out. Some of the inspiration we'll post afterwards as well, and we'll be sending this off for subtitles so everyone can watch and enjoy what you've said today. Thanks again for joining on this extremely hot day in London, and keep us posted and speak to you soon. Thanks again.
Thank you, Chelsea.